How do you write a villain who's physically weaker than the hero? This is actually a really compelling way to write a villain because it forces them to be complex rather than one big overpowered blob. This can also play with our emotions as we generally like to root for the underdog. So if our villain is physically weaker than the hero, how do we write them in a way that they present a credible threat? One way is for the villain to weaken the hero, to bring them down to their level. Having the villain target our hero's greatest strength is great from a story perspective because it shows that the villain is innovative, and it's also going to force the hero to get innovative. Lex Luthor will often use kryptonite to bring Superman down to his level physically. But I think an even better example of this is the Batman villain Scarecrow. Scarecrow is often depicted as very scrawny physically, but he is able to use his fear toxin to use Batman's greatest weapon, his mind, against him. A great way for a villain to level the playing field is through use of political manipulation. In this scenario, a villain will use manipulation and espionage to turn society against a hero or a group of heroes against each other. This is done to great effect in Captain America's Civil War. Zemo is physically weaker than any one of the Avengers, but by pitting them against each other, he's able to use their own powers against them. A physically weak villain can still be very powerful through use of a network. Think of a villainous network as a huge robotic body with the villain representing the brain. In this scenario, a villain can be a complete weakling physically as long as they can utilize the network to carry out their bidding. This is shown brilliantly in the character of Hector Salamanca from Breaking Bad. Because of a stroke, Hector is able to do almost nothing physically, but he's still a character of terrifying power because of his position in the drug-running network. One of the best ways to show a physically weak villain as formidable is through their mastery over information. A villain can be weak in almost every way possible, but if they hold mastery over information, it still feels like they're holding all the cards. This encompasses everything from knowing sensitive information, allowing them to blackmail others, or possessing critical information about characters' weaknesses. A perfect example of this is Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal is in a physically weak position because he's locked in a box, but it never feels that way because he possesses the key information that our hero needs. If you examine the most famous villains in fiction, you'll often find it's mastery of information that gives them their edge.
Magic systems. Let's talk about them through my own, which is a hard magic system with clear rules, whereas a soft magic system is more ambiguous with loose guidelines. My magic system, called Gathering in my webcomic, has well-defined rules, and by my 5th episode I have even introduced Ogmology, which is the branch of science dedicated to it. However, there are aspects of my magic system that may appear soft to readers, in particular the ancient technology of Avabu, which is mostly shrouded in mystery, even though I have underlying rules for all of it. Hard and soft magic systems both have their own strengths and weaknesses. It's just important to balance what aspects of it you reveal or hide from readers, and remind yourself how it solves conflict and what limitations it has.
Honor your writing process. I have been a writer and an editor for over 11 years, and if there is one thing that I have learned in this crazy industry of entertainment and writing and just loving on people with storytelling, it's this. Stories go to the authors and the writers and the visionaries that they want to tell their story. I don't view stories as wild imaginings taking off in the brain. I believe that these are living, breathing things that exist somewhere in energetic form that are trying to come through the author to truly be witnessed by the world. Your story aligns with you for a reason. It wants to come through you for a reason. So honor your process. And any professional who tells you otherwise is pretty shitty at their job. That's not what we do. My job as an editor is to pull the magic out of my authors in ways that they just didn't see it or know how to before.
One of the ways to create a compelling villain is to outline your book from your villain's POV first. My name's Danielle, I'm a developmental editor and young adult fiction author. So here's what I do with my books. Actually, the last 2 books that I've drafted, I thought out the entire storyline from my villain. I don't write through his POV. I write through Hollis's POV. She's my 16-year-old protagonist in this dystopian world I've created. But I approached the story from my villain's POV first, and I plotted out exactly what he wanted and exactly how he was going to get what he wanted and all the steps that he was going to take to succeed. Now, obviously, he won't succeed in the very end because good always wins, but what that created was a mountain of obstacles for Hollis to overcome. and it created a really dynamic villain that's going to be very hard to beat. And then I went through my story and then I plotted the book from Hollis's perspective, my protagonist, and I was like, well, what does she want? How is she gonna get it? But the way that it weaved together with my villain's wants and goals was so beautiful because I already knew everything my villain wanted and exactly how he planned to get what he wanted. It is the intersection of the antagonist's goals and the protagonist's goals that create the kind of conflict that is compelling in a book. So if you've never tried that, I suggest outline your book from your villain's POV first and then move on to the hero. You will be amazed what you come up with.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
How do we do audience reveals without letting the main character know while writing in first person? To answer the first half of this, personally, I don't like when books or stories switch back and forth between first and third person. I didn't even particularly like it when the ACOTAR series did this and switched from Feyre's point of view in first person to Nesta's point of view in third person, and those were completely separate books. So while some people disagree with me and say that you can totally mix and match first and third person, I think it's a really tough line to toe. What I would do if you were in this situation is I would treat your story like a mystery that you're plotting out and make sure that you put down clues that your audience will pick up, even though the main character doesn't pick up on those clues. An example of this is in Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a young governess and she gets posted with Mr. Rochester. There's a woman in the household that she doesn't particularly like called Grace Poole. She doesn't like Grace because she has this really creepy laugh. One night, Jane hears this laugh. She knows it's Grace Poole. She gets up after hearing it and finds that Mr. Rochester's room is on fire and he's asleep. Someone tried to set him on fire. And so she wakes him up and she saves him. And she's like, yeah, my dude, that was Grace Poole. And she finds it very concerning that he does not fire her. It makes absolutely no sense, neither to the audience nor to Jane, that he wouldn't fire someone who was trying to set them on fire. What actually happened is Mr. Rochester is a little bit of a problematic gaslighting king, and he secretly has a wife who suffers from mental illness, and it was her who set his bed on fire, and Grace Poole is just the cover story. So that's an example of planting a clue that your audience is going to pick up on, even if your main character either completely has that clue fly over their head that something's the matter, or if they kind of feel weird about it, but they don't look into it too much. Another example is in Harry Potter. As you read through the series, it's very obvious that Harry's a Horcrux. You see his ability to see into Voldemort's perspective. Super engaged readers very likely picked up on the fact that he was a Horcrux before Harry realized himself. One way to test this to see if you have good clues is to keep track of them and sticky tab them when you're reading through your work again to edit it. So for example, in ACOTAR, when we read through that first book, Feyre said that Rhys was the most beautiful man she had ever seen. And there are also some other clues to the fact that he is her mate. Another way you could do an audience reveal without switching between multiple character POVs is have a supporting character comment on a situation. Maybe show that they don't feel comfortable with something that's happening, or maybe show that they're in on something. Have the main character just ignore what they're saying. I'd be really interested to hear what other writers think of this. I sat here and I couldn't think of any other ways to do audience reveals in first person without letting the main character know.
But I miss you in the mornings when I see the sun. Something in the orange tells me we're not done. To you I'm just a man, to me you're all I am. Where the hell am I supposed to go? I'm poison myself again. Something in the orange tells me you're never coming home. If you leave today, I'll just stare at the way the orange touches all things around. The grass, trees, and dew, how I just hate you. Please turn those headlights around.
Ooh, do I have advice for world building? Yep. And I also have an opinion that's kind of unpopular, but then I have a piece of advice that everyone can agree on that's going to be helpful. Let's start with my opinion. I think that no matter how sophisticated the world you create is, you only need to include the parts of that world that actually impact the story in your story. I think a lot of us get wrapped up in too much research and then it results in info dumping. So my advice is write the story first and then world build as needed. If you hate this, don't do it and listen on. Here's what I've learned from working with lots of writers writing high fantasy. You're gonna create a rudimentary world building Bible to make sure that everything makes sense. I'm talking real foundation stuff. Like really think of the building blocks like government, geography, farming, food, education, religion, how the society works. Because these are the things that are creating obstacles and opportunities for your characters and you want them to make sense.
Fellow world builders, do you often have trouble simply just starting to create a city or a township? When I first started world building, I was fixated on being able to provide a visual to nearly every location my party went to, and that usually came in the form of a map. While I love map making and still use maps as the main visual for my world, I've stopped relying on them to create cities and townships. The thing about maps is that unless you're an artist or have the money to hire one, you'll most likely be using some sort of map making website. The problem with these websites is that they usually only have a finite amount of resources and assets that you can use to bring your vision to life. As a result, I started to notice that all my cities and towns began to look similar to each other. And I would dread making a new city because I knew I'd be stuck at my computer for hours upon hours using limited resources to try and make it unique. And then, I realized something. Matt Mercer's Exandria, otherwise known as the setting for Critical Role, has some of the most interesting and diverse locations and cities that I've ever seen in fantasy. Not even once in their hundreds of episodes spanning multiple campaigns has Matt ever given his players a city map. And yet, I'm willing to bet that everyone who's watched Critical Role has these grand visions of Vasselheim, Ank'Harel, Zadash, you name it. I realized that the map doesn't make the city. The way you describe your city to your players does more work than the map ever could. So when building your city or township, I propose this. Do away with the map-making software, at least at first. Write a detailed description of everything you see in your mind when you're making your new city. Eliminate the barriers of technology and let your imagination run wild. As long as you can use your words to convey that image, the best tool you have for world building is your brain. I hope this helped, and I'll see you next time.
George R.R. Martin once described two different types of writers: architects, also known as plotters, and gardeners, also known as pantsers. An architect is someone who might do a good deal of planning before they actually start their story, creating detailed outlines, character sheets such as bios, backstories, and descriptions, doing a lot of research before they start, creating timelines in which the writing is to be done, or figuring out the story's ending ahead of time. They might consider how many segments of the story they want to exist within the narrative, such as how many chapters, how many books, how many episodes. An architect might like to flesh out the world that they're going to be creating before they actually start writing. An architect might like to take time to think about the themes, motifs, and symbols that they want to incorporate into their story even before they start. Or they might like to think about the message that the story is trying to give the reader or audience well ahead of time. Now, a writer can choose to not do any of these things before starting their story and still be considered an architect. It really is a mindset about creating structure and balance to your story, either because it helps you to think in a more linear, organized fashion, or because you simply don't want to run into any snags, complications, or plot holes later down the line.
The way you feel. One kiss is all it takes. Falling in love with me.
I don't know how many years on this earth I got left. I'm gonna get real weird with it.
The relationship between husband and wife is psychological. One is psycho, the other is logical. Please don't try to figure out who is who.